Morning, colleagues. Thank you so much. I always say, never clap at the start. It's rubbish. Anyway, it's really good to be here. I actually trained here about 1,000 years or so ago, so it's great to come back. I'm delighted. Is there a clicker? Do I have a clicker? I haven't. I can try and do it by mentioning it. Lovely, thank you. So, brilliant. Thank you very much indeed. Brilliant. Lovely, thank you. It's a really important day today, and I feel really honoured to be speaking at this conference today as you come together as a community to build practice, to learn, and to take your thinking and your care for young people to a deeper place. So I've taken as my theme, where charity and love is, there is God. And what follows from that is that I try to hold myself to account for how I conduct myself, for how I treat other people, for how I live out my intellectual and academic life. And I think any of us who are working within the educational sector in general and within settings of a religious character in particular, I think we have an additional obligation on ourselves to try to hold ourselves to higher standards than might be elsewhere in the rest of the sector. So I would say, I never arrive anywhere to be popular. I just say things as I see them, so I do expect to be challenged on some of this. So we know that the sector is currently talking a lot about the quality of education, in the curriculum in particular, and Ofsted's work framing it around the 3 I's of intent, implementation and impact. Does make me slightly annoyed that some parts of the media are talking about the curriculum as though it's a new thing, as though none of us have been doing anything on the curriculum like forever. It's very patronising, but I think it's no bad thing that we are at a time where the quality of what is offered to all our children is put under the spotlight again, but with a sense of humility from all of us and not judgment by others. Some of what we're doing is marvellous, and let's honour that and celebrate that, and some of it needs tightening up. But that's fine, that's just how it is. So I'm slightly concerned that some parts of the sector are reframing all their work around the 3 I's just because it's Ofsted's way of looking at their research and the way they're having conversations about the judgments they make. We're running our schools, we're running our classrooms for our children, not for random Ofsted inspectors who come in to look at what we're doing. The important thing is that we have the conversations around why we have this curriculum in this school, how well it lands on children's desks, and whether we know whether it's having any impact. But I think it's quite healthy to move away from a bit of that, so I'm just playing around with some of the ideas. Is our intent for our subject, the curriculum in the school generally, and our subject of religious education as well? We need to be answering the question, why are we teaching this? Why is it important? But I think there's another lens beyond that, which is also intentional, because that then takes us from the words on a website into the lived experience, both for us as teachers and for our children. It starts bringing it alive. The next question I'm asking myself is the work I'm offering to my children invitational? Am I drawing them in to a space of beauty, dignity, scholarship, and am I holding myself to account for that? Because if I'm serious about charity and love, linking to coming to a space where the divine might be, I think I've got to be asking myself these questions. And then finally, the 3rd I on my metrics is it impressive? So what we're offering our children coming from a really deep space and place, and are they producing beautiful work? I'm going to turn now to how this links to the conversations that I think are more fruitful around the quality of what we offer our children. And I'm going to turn now to the 3 C's that I've been working on, moving away slightly from Ofsted's agenda. But thinking first of all of some of the reasons why the quality of what we offer our children is taking a higher focus within inspection judgments. So there have been a number of reasons, a number of controversies that have led to this, and I've just summarised them as 3. And I think they've got a bearing on religious education, as well as the curriculum more generally. So the first is that we know, both in my work and in the inspectorate's work, it's been identified that in some schools, priorities have become distorted. Actually for understandable reasons, but in a bid to try and make sure that children do well, for instance, in their SATs in Year 6. Some children in some schools get a diminished diet because they're getting a diet of SATs practice, inference and comprehension papers, for instance, for the English papers, in the mistaken belief that that is going to get them better results. So children need some practice. Any more than some practice, it doesn't make any difference. And we keep giving them practice, they go backwards. When you look at the reading papers for the children who don't do so well in the SATs papers, it tends to be a lack of vocabulary. So how do we build children's vocabulary? Well, some schools are interpreting this as children learning lists of spellings. Well, vocabulary, those are important, obviously, but vocabulary development is a much bigger piece of work than that. So if we're thinking seriously about how we develop children's vocabulary, it's actually through a broad and balanced curriculum. Now, for those of us, or those of you, because I don't currently work in the Catholic sector, but those of us who are in the Catholic sector, I think we've got an obligation. Our RE won't be compromised in schools of a religious character, but other subjects might be. And I think we have a duty to open up discussions about this. If this is happening in schools where we're involved either as governors, as leaders, if it's been cut back, otherwise I don't think we can follow the line of where there's charity and love, there is God also. The second reason is that there have been some misconceptions about the curriculum. So there's been an overemphasis on skills development at the expense of children knowing things. And where this has arisen from is the idea that skills are transferable. Well, for the most part, they're not. Skills are developed through encounter with, engagement with, and doing something with the big ideas within the subject domains in general, and religious education in particular. So there's been some pushback on this, that some people are saying, well, we're in danger of turning our curricula into a pub quiz, or some sort of Gradgrindian version of education. This is a complete misrepresentation. Our children are entitled to know and encounter the big ideas within each of the subjects, and from that their skills are going to grow. Because at the moment, if I can analyse something well, for instance, in geography, does not mean to say I can do the same in religious education if I don't know anything about that unit in RE. So this is why we must start to think of them as being like conjoined twins. The skills emerge from knowing things. The third area that's been identified is the notion of entitlement. And this here is where I think we have some quite sharp questions to ask ourselves and of the sector about the provision that is currently on offer for many of our children who might need additional support. So some of those children get so much additional support that they're missing out from the wider entitlement of their peers. So So we've got to think very hard that if children need any interventions, they're as focused and as relevant and have as much impact as soon as possible, so that those children are working and learning alongside their peers. Otherwise the gaps are going to widen. I was in a Year 4 class a little while ago, and the children were preparing to do some imaginative writing. You could tell it was going to lead to some great work. There were some lovely ideas coming out. But at the side of the classroom there were 6 children and an adult, and they were cutting out and sticking in the mistaken belief that they couldn't cope. Those children could have coped with appropriate support. Now, I'm not saying this is going on in your schools, but it is going on in some schools. Where we know this is happening, I think we've got an obligation, if we're living true to our moral purpose, that we actually ask some questions about this, not in a judgmental way, but actually opening up the conversations, because we're talking about an entitlement for every child. More widely, though, we need to take account, I think, of what all children are saying about their experiences. So pupil and student voice is a very big thread of my work. It's a research interest of mine. If I ran Ofsted, I'd make pupil and student voice the first plank of evidence on an inspection. This is why I'm not running Ofsted. But what I found in my work in and out of schools, including, for instance, with the ATCRE quality mark, is that if what children say bears a very strong correlation to the final judgment of a school. And it's not the children say, oh, it's measures here, don't you know, or it's outstanding. It's nothing as crude as that. It's 2 things. It's when you ask them, well, can you give me some examples of where you're really thinking and working hard in your lessons? The kinds of responses they give are a very strong indicator of whether they're really being given challenging, demanding work. And that's one strand. The second thread, in terms of making that judgment, is how articulate they are in making those comments. I take it really seriously. Anyway, so I do a lot of pupil and student voice, and at the heart of what they're saying is that they'd like more demanding work, please. They're like, whatever their starting points, a common thread is we'd like more demanding work. So I've got just a few examples to share this with you, but I think we really do need to be taking what children say seriously. If we're being true to the mandate that I've given myself, that where there's charity and love, then there's also God is there too. So the first example I'm going to give is from secondary, and then I've got a few more generally. So I was doing some work in a North London school a while ago, and as part of that work I was asked to talk to some students that the school had identified as being high prior-attaining but underachieving, able but idle. Do you have any of those in your context? No? Oh, lucky you. Well, I know exactly what they look like because I managed to produce a couple myself. So. And they've grown out of it now, which is why I can talk about it, but I bear the scars, I can tell you. So I was talking to this group of students. They were year 9, there were about 8 of them, and they happened to be all boys. And I said, is there any subject in this school where you're not locking around? Because they weren't working, but they were stopping others from working, and that's what I needed to unpick. And in this school, it turned out it was geography. So I said, tell me what's going on in geography then. And they said, well, our teacher just gives us really interesting things to read and to talk about. And we just love it. So, for instance, for homework, she'll give us articles to read from publications like the National Geographic. And what she says to us is, your job for homework is to read this. Now, you're not going to understand it all, but that's all right, because at the start of the next lesson, we're going to talk about what you did understand and what you didn't understand. And they were just buzzing with excitement. Now, I was in this teacher's classroom that day, and she had the same high expectations for all students, regardless of their prior attainment. When I checked the results for geography in that school, they were the highest by a margin in a very high-performing school. and similarly nationally. Now that teacher did not give those children work above their pay grade in order to get great results. The great results followed from the children being given difficult, demanding work and supported to get there. It's that way around. So one of the questions we might want to ask ourselves is, what's the equivalent of the National Geographic in religious education? What are the things that are above our children's currently where they're working, significantly above, that we support them with through talk? Is my question, is mine. Now the next example, and I've got this very small, let's say a bit of background about this, from Alison Peacock's book, Assessment for Learning Without Limits, which came out in 2015. Highly recommended, every school should have a copy, really good. Alison's now the CEO of the Chartered College of Teaching. Any colleagues involved in the Chartered College? Oh good, a number of you, great. I'm arguing that every school should have at least one member of staff who's a member of the Chartered College of Teaching, because the quality of resources and materials on pedagogy in general and the curriculum in particular is phenomenal. And I think the school should pay. They're very good at spending heads' money, which is why I always make a quick exit. Anyway, it's not much. In this book, she and a colleague were interviewing some children as they went from year 5 into year 6. And what they were trying to tease out is what the children thought of ability tables in their primary classrooms. But actually, the children are talking about the amount of work they've given, the level of challenge, which is why I'm using this. But I'm just going to say a few words about the notion of ability and how it relates to my theme. I have real concerns about the use of the term ability in the sector, where it has consequences for children. All I can talk about with any kind of reliability is prior attainment. What have my pupils or students done up until now? But the minute that there are consequences for children being labelled low ability in primary and lower sets in secondary, where they're stuck, I think there are some big questions to ask ourselves. Particularly if we're in settings or a sector which is underpinned by faith. So one of my concerns is that those children tend to get easier work, a diminished diet compared with their peers, as I've already indicated. The second concern is that by and large those children are working with the least qualified and the least experienced adults in the school. This is not to put down the work of TAs, HLTAs, NQTs, RQTs. I do a lot of work with them. I have enormous respect for them. But I think there are some questions to be asked within the sector, if we're truly coming from a place of love, that we've got to ask ourselves, why are our most vulnerable children getting the easiest work with the least qualified adults in the sector? My final concern is this, colleagues, that if you look at the profiles of the children who are on the bottom tables in the lower sets in secondary, where they're stuck, I'm not talking about where they're fluid, and I do mean fluid week by week, a higher proportion of those children have people bring in funding. Now, what's that about? Because however we determine intelligence or IQ, both highly contested notions, I refuse to believe it's linked to postcode or parental wealth. As a sector, we talk about diminishing differences, closing gaps, equity and social justice. Colleagues, I put it to you that we have some systems and structures within our system that are widening those gaps. So on the back of that, I think we have a moral obligation to raise some questions, not in an accusatory way, not in a condemning people, but actually unpicking some of what's going on here. So this is what the children had to say. It's quite small, I'm afraid, but I'm going to read it out and these slides will be made available. So, the first day the children were back, we asked them what they thought of ability groups. The answers were astounding. The more able loved it. They enjoyed being the bright ones and having the special challenges set by the teacher. The middle group were annoyed that they didn't get the same work and challenges as the other group. They wanted to try harder work, but they'd worked out they'd never be moved up as there were only 6 seats on the table. On the top end. The less able were affected the most. They felt dumb, useless. They thought they'd never be allowed challenges as they usually work with a teaching assistant. This less able group liked the sound of some of the challenges the top group had, but they knew they would never get the chance. So we are rationing interesting, demanding work based on what I consider to be flawed notions of ability. And this is happening in RE as well. Not in your schools, but it is happening. Okay. I'm conscious of time, so I'm going to leave these slides for people to look at later. But essentially, Lindsay Hanley is talking about, she wrote a really good book called Respectable, which came out in the last year. She grew up on a sink estate in Birmingham, high levels of deprivation and poverty, and she's talking about the difference that one teacher made, about the difference. At the beginning of the year, he instituted 2 weekly institutions, the general knowledge quiz, children like knowing stuff, and the classroom debate, children like talking. In hindsight, the reason these felt so special, so invigorating, was that both were vehicles for verbal reasoning and for testing abstract concepts, neither of which our previous teachers had paid particular attention to. Now, this was in the early 80s, okay, but there's still a bit of this going on. We've got to pay attention. We must pay attention to what children are crying out for. They're crying out for access to big, difficult ideas, which are then unpacked through talk. I never saw stronger evidence that you're taught how to be inarticulate. You learn how to be ignorant through what is withheld from you. Mr. Bowell gave us a chance to talk and to reason before our ability to do so was allowed to wither from inattention. So I'm going to turn now, colleagues, to what the children are saying. They want access to big ideas. They like doing big ideas. They like having access to big ideas. When we're thinking about the curriculum and we're revisiting some of the elements within the curriculum, the concepts are incredibly important. They're like holding baskets for new information. If I understand a concept, information that relates to that concept is much stickier. A lot of cognitive science supporting the idea that the concepts are incredibly important. Of course, RE is laden with great concepts. So we need to make sure these are taught explicitly to support our children, but also starts making some of our planning easier as well. So there's plenty of concepts, but there aren't too many. But it then stops the curriculum from being fragmented as far as the children's experience is concerned. So, yes, so the power of these is that they're like holding baskets for lots of information, and I'm arguing that they contain hidden gems. A lot of the concepts are Tier 3 vocabulary, and we're all very keen to make sure our children understand the specialist vocabulary of the domains in which we're teaching, aren't we? So this is why it's worth paying attention to them. But a lot of the words in the subject-specific areas of whether it's history, geography, or religious education, they quite often have words that are derived from other languages, including Latin and Greek. And what I'm arguing is that when we get into the etymology of the words, it starts opening up a new landscape for children to which I'm arguing they are entitled. I'm not going to go through all these, I'm just going to take a couple. I'm going to take isosceles first of all, but if we talk to children about what the term isosceles means, they can generally tell us because we're pretty good at teaching definitions. But I'm arguing that children's learning and their understanding would be deeper if they knew that the word isosceles came from 2 Greek words. Isos is equal and skeles is legs. They've got a bigger understanding of what it is, and when they meet isobar, isometric and other parts of the curriculum, they've got a clue it's got something to do with equal. Now, sometimes people say, Mary, this is a bit hard for children, and I say, yes, it's meant to be. They're asking for hard work. They're asking for difficult, demanding work. And what I haven't had a chance today is to build in the findings from cognitive science that support all that. We are a challenge-seeking species. We like doing things that are difficult. We are motivated by curiosity. And And so, yes, it's meant to be difficult. People sometimes say, well, this depends on the subject knowledge of the teacher. Well, yes, it does. If teachers are missing some subject knowledge and that needs to be developed, this is a professional development need, and leaders need to be paying attention to that as part of support. But when I say, they say it's difficult, I say, well, hang on a minute, we've got children at the age of 4 in the sector, some of whom are fluent in dinosaurs, aren't they? And some of those children know that the word dinosaur comes from 2 Greek words. Dinos is scary, sauros is lizard. Now, children could do this at 4, they can do it all the way through. What we're finding with the schools that are working with this, for the most part, we just find some interesting words and say, I wonder where that comes from. Code for homework. We teach children how to do it. Put in the word into Google, plus etymology, it throws up. Enough children will come back and talk about it the next lesson. Yes, with the schools that are doing work on this, they're saying that the greatest gains are with the children who have the greatest language deficit. And when you unpack why, they say that the children come back absolutely delighted to know more and be able to talk more about big ideas. There's a surprise. So this is why we must never ever be thinking of limiting what we think our children are capable of. We give them an invitation to come into this big stuff. And I'm just going to say a few words about incarnation, because for the most part I'd just be saying to children, it's an interesting word, on a knowledge, organised, whatever, find out what it means, come back and we talk about it. But if we then identify as part of our planning the concepts, for instance, incarnation, we can teach those from the front. So I've got colleagues in Suffolk, Year 1, just before Christmas, and the run-up to Christmas, were teaching pupils in Year 1 about the account of the Nativity through the concept of incarnation. And so they said to the children, this is a really important idea for Christians, that God became human in the form of baby Jesus at Christmas. It's got a big word, incarnation. In comes from the Latin for in. Aren't we clever? We can all speak some Latin. And the carn bit comes from the Latin for flesh. And we get chili con carne, carnation, carnival, all from the same root. And then they say, incarnation is a really important idea for Christians because they believe that God took flesh, became a human being in the form of baby Jesus at Christmas. And the children get lots and lots of practice, Year 1, at saying this really important idea. God became human in the form of baby Jesus at Christmas. Starts rolling off the tongue. It then means that when the children are being read to the accounts of the Nativity in Luke, the Nativity plays where Uncle Tom, Cobbly and all come and see them, wonderful. When all that twinkly stuff that goes on in primary schools, lots of it's lovely, some of it's a bit naff, never mind. We love it. It's all held within the concept of incarnation. It gives them an intellectual basket in which to hold this fundamental piece of Christian theology, rather than it just being random stuff we do. And this is why the concepts are so important. This is children's entitlement to know this and to be able to talk about it, regardless of the teacher's faith or belief background, regardless of the children's faith or belief background. And similarly for other big ideas and concepts within Christian theology and other faiths as well. And then when they're teaching Easter, it's all done through the concept of salvation, same process. The only thing I can't work out how to fit in is the Easter rabbit. Someone tried to tell me a while ago there probably is a link. I'd still teach about the Easter bunny or the Easter rabbit because that's quite important, but they do need to know this fundamental piece of Christian theology around salvation. Okay, so now some schools are taking this a little further in wanting to build on children's delight in making these connections. And why wouldn't we want to make our learning and our lessons delightful for children? So they're using a lovely resource called Telling Tales in Latin by Lorna Robinson. And here we've got Ovid, who's going to be teaching us about some metamorphoses. And this is how he starts off. He says, Ovid says, "I'm here to tell these tales to you, which makes me the narrator of this little book." You might know the word narrator, but did you know it comes from the Latin word narro, which means I tell a story? The word for book is liber, which gives us another common English word. Maybe you can guess what it is. So what are your children likely to respond to that? They can immediately make the connections, can't they? So you'll be heartbroken to hear, colleagues, that we haven't got time to do any Latin on the scene. But we would be able to if we had time, because the connections are so rich. And another bit there. Imagine how clever children feel when a bit later on, a few pages on, they've realised they've worked out what all these words mean. And the case I'm making is that it's part of my job, and others might want it's my job to make children feel clever. It's my job to make children feel accomplished. It's my job to make children feel scholarly. So I'm going to turn now, colleagues, to conversations and just share a few things with you. One of the things I'm most concerned about is that we don't privilege talk enough in the sector. As we're obsessed with written outcomes, as though they're the only ones that have any worth. But I cannot write anything well unless I have spoken, unless I have listened, unless I have read. And as the great James Britton said in 1970, writing floats on a sea of talk. Writing floats on a sea of talk. Want to raise outcomes, want to improve standards. We privilege talk in classrooms is the argument I'm going to be making. There's one school that takes this really seriously. Some of you might be aware of School 21. They believe as oracy, the ability to speak well, is one of the biggest indicators of a child's success later in life. I'm arguing it's a fundamental human right for every individual, adult or child, to have their ideas and opinions heard by others. We honour this in classrooms. We expect every child to talk. If they can get words out, we should be supporting them to talk. Too many people saying, "But how can I do that if my children are shy?" Don't say to a child who's shy, "Oh, never mind, you don't need to learn your times tables. Don't need to read or write. It's my job to support them." In this school, 3 to 19, they great results. Poor part of London. Philosophy for children, storytelling school in primary. Wonderful, wonderful dialogue going on. Their curriculum intent is underpinned by head, the intellect, heart, that notion that we all want to make a contribution to our communities and to society, amazing, and then hand. How often do we provide opportunities for our children to produce beautiful work? Is it mostly worksheets stuck in books? Anyway, in the primary, they take this so seriously that every child in year 3 gives a 4-minute speech to an invited audience without notes. Every child in year 3 is supported to get that. Now, I'm not suggesting all schools should do this. Well, I'd love it if they did. It's not a 3-line whip, but this is how seriously they take the honouring of the voice and talk. I was talking about this a while ago, and a deputy head came to me at the end of the session, and she said, "We had a child in our school who was in the care of the local authority. Social workers were so concerned about this child's behaviour because family circumstances had been so dreadful that they worried about whether the child would ever be fostered, let alone adopted." This child was adopted by a family who live in London, went to Stratford. She said the father sent her the 4-minute clip of the child when he was in year 3 giving his speech to an invited audience without notes. So my argument is that if a child with that level of deprivation and trauma can be supported to do it, if we're really wanting to draw out the skills and the gifts in every individual child, we do this with rigour and compassion and love. I'm going to turn now to building on conversations relating to story. In the cognitive science jargon, our brains privilege story. And I don't think we use stories well enough in the curriculum. If we want to really drive and power a curriculum, we build in stories. Which curriculum area has the best stories? Only. Let's whip those stories out. Okay, we have an emotional connection to stories and we have an intellectual connection with stories. We do need to be privileging them, I'm arguing, if we're working on the principles of charity and love. Really interesting piece of work which came out of Sussex University a year or so ago, simply reading challenging complex novels aloud and at a fast pace in each lesson repositioned poorer readers as good readers, giving them a more engaged, uninterrupted experience over a sustained period. So this is what happened. It might be English, it might be secondary. I'm asking myself, what are the implications for me in RE if I think this is important, whether I'm in primary or secondary? So they took 2 novels, selected to be at least a year above what children would normally be studying. That's all they did for 12 weeks in English lessons. Quite a small project, 365 students, but they found over the length of this project that all students' reading ages had improved by 8.5 months. What had happened for the children with lower starting points, they'd improved by 16 months. I don't think I can afford to ignore this kind of research coming out of projects. What am I going to do about it in my RE plans? I might be considering doing some small-scale research. I've got a colleague who's taken this on board, and he's spending half a term with students in Year 7 reading C.S. Lewis's On the Problem of Pain. It might not work. I think it will work. I think it's going to raise children's literacy. But if it doesn't matter. We've got a lot of time at Key Stage 3. Believe it or not, we've got 3 years. We can afford half a term to see what happens. So threading through this is entitlement. I'm arguing, colleagues, that wherever we are in the curriculum in general and in RE in particular, that we take note of what all our children entitlement, we take note of what the cognitive science is pointing to, that we underpin our work through stories, through concepts and through talk, and where there are opportunities that we layer on then richness of art, music and research where appropriate. I'm now going to say a few words about the implementation we can have all these marvellous ideas on our plans and our websites, but actually what's the quality of what lands in our classrooms for children? So I'm just going to say a few words about that. Can I just confirm I'm okay to 10 past? Did I read that right? Thank you. So I'm arguing that if we're serious about entitlement for every child being offered the great gifts that our subject has to give, I think we've got to make sure we're privileging thinking over task completion. Because too often as a sector we're inclined to say, have you finished? I don't care if you've finished, tell me what you've learned. What got me thinking about this was I was talking to a child who was looking at her English book, Year 4, and there's some really lovely work in there. But I noticed that a few lessons before I assumed she'd learnt about homophones because she'd completed a worksheet, it had been downloaded, she completed it, ticked, signed off by the teacher, smiley face, no doubt sitting on some spreadsheet, having turned it green to validate the fact she'd learnt it. So I said she had. So I thought, oh, homophones, really interesting. So what have you learnt about homophones? Not a clue. Not a clue. Bright little thing. Why? Because the completion of the task was more important than whether she'd actually got it. And I'm arguing, if a child can't talk about it, I haven't taught them. It should have the potential to lead to mastery, not in every lesson, but over time. Am I taking my children to a place where they can do something new on their own terms as a result of what I've taught them, or are they just parroting back what I've said? And the third thing I'm arguing is that it should be beautiful. We've got a lot of dusty, dated resources in the sector, colleagues, in general, and RE, there's some pretty ropey stuff too. I'm not talking about anyone's resources in this room, but across the sector there are. Anyway, So why am I talking about beauty? Well, William Morris said we shouldn't have anything in our homes that we don't know to be useful or believe to be beautiful. Second reason I'm drawing on beauty is that Plato said that in order for Republic 13, in order for children to learn, they need to play with lovely things. Now, I don't think Plato meant play as in mucking about. I think he meant that deep engagement in gross good stuff. And so, if these are my criteria, what do we make of this? So here's some children are learning about the interiors of places of worship, and in general, they're learning about a mosque. So I'm just looking at that image. Colleagues, this is not good enough. That image isn't good enough. Anyway, the children are then going to fill in the gaps, fill in the blanks. But let's use it, colleagues, with a clear conscience, because it's eco, it's ink saving. Anyway, just below this, someone's written in, I know there's a spelling mistake, but bear with me, dear Twinkle. I'm really concerned about the twinkleisation of the primary curriculum. Other dodgy websites are available, but anyway. I believe there are two mistakes on the sheet. The Qibla is the direction to Makkah, and the mihrab is the place where the imam stands to lead the prayer. The mihrab can also indicate the direction to Makkah. Kind regards, someone who knows. And dear Twinkle, I mean there's truckloads of this stuff. Dear Twinkle, they did change it, but my concern is that before it was changed to the correct version, this would have landed this incorrect information in hundreds, if not thousands, of different classrooms. The only saving grace is that because it didn't privilege thinking over task completion, the children probably didn't remember. It's pretty poor comfort, isn't it? Then we're going to design a mosque. This is neither art nor RE. It's just a junk exercise. And then finally, as we put ourselves out of our misery, we're going to design our own prayer mat, and we're going to include images and symbols of people and things that are important to you. I'm a Muslim child. This lands on my desk. This is deeply offensive. There's a very small tradition within Islam where it's acceptable to have images of human form, but for the most part this is blasphemy. And we're allowing this junk into our classroom. Shame on us, colleagues. But I don't blame teachers. I don't blame teachers for downloading this sort of stuff. I might be tempted, well I wouldn't actually, but I can understand it. If I've been up till midnight because I'm expected to prepare half a dozen differentiated coloured worksheets that are going to widen gaps. If I'm in a school where if it moves, we mark it. And where I'm expected to put in junk data which is neither valid nor reliable, I'm going to turn to this sort of stuff. But why would I? Why would I if I knew that there was a website called Museum with No Frontiers, which has got authentic art and artefacts from the Islamic world? Why would I use junk if I knew this? So the piece of work to be done in the sector, I think, generally, and in RE in particular, is that leaders need to be making the space for colleagues to find this stuff, otherwise we default, as a sector, I'm not talking about individuals here, to junk materials. Our children deserve more. So what I'm arguing from this, whether it's RE or any other subject, we use the materials, the resources, the artifacts, the images, the sacred text, the poetry, the art, that reside in that domain. This is children's entitlement, and we do not mediate it through NAF resources. I don't have time to go through this, colleagues, but it's on my website. But I've worked up an example. It's all very me standing here saying, this isn't good enough. Yeah, but what do you suggest instead, Mary? So anyway, on my website, I've pulled together some resources saying, actually, we need to be using proper stories, we need to be building in some beautiful art, and some music. And I'm going to finish with this, colleagues, to wrap it up. Sums up the space I aspire to be. I'm a long way from there, but what am I trying to do? So this is an allegory which has come from the Swiss Cottage School in North London, a special school in North London, doing groundbreaking work nationally and internationally. And here we've got two students who wanted to learn to become musicians. They volunteered to do this. So Learner A was given a 12-page list of outcomes which were related in some way to playing the guitar. So the teacher ticks them all off one by one, identifies the colour of the guitar. What's that got anyway? Counts the strings, plucks the strings. Over time, Learner A had met most of the outcomes on the first 8 pages of the list. Teachers using them to show the impact of her lessons, why not, and how he's reaching higher levels. After several years, a visitor walks into the classroom and asks Learner A to play the guitar, probably told by everyone in the room, not possible as he's never attempted before. Visitor then looked through the 12-page list of outcomes. By this point, almost all of them have been ticked. Teacher explained this was because Learner A had met them and he's now working at a higher level, she proudly said to the visitor. He then proceeded to ask Learner A questions related to the very first outcome, which had been ticked some time ago. What colour is your guitar, my friend, he asked, and he wasn't able to answer. Meanwhile, with Teacher B, Learner B was set the learning intention, I'll perform in front of a live audience. The first time Learner B tried to do this, he nervously shook a tambourine and sung alongside Teacher B, who played the guitar. He then learned to join in by slowly strumming the guitar with support from one of his friends, and over several years he learned some simple chords and tunes and became more comfortable with bigger and less familiar audiences. Each term his learning intention was adjusted to enable greater mastery. After several years, Visitor walked into the classroom to the sound of Learner B rehearsing his own guitar composition using 2 to 3 chords, making only a few technical errors. Isn't this beautiful? He smiled and turned to Teacher B. Music to my ears. So if we're guided by the principles of charity and love, we kind of know where we're meant to be, don't we? So let's remember as we go about this work that we're human beings first, we're professionals second. We hold ourselves to account, but in a way that is both robust and kind. That our children are human beings first, their learners second. Where there's love and charity, there's also God. Thank you, colleagues.